the U.S. and the Trump administration's decision to pause U.S. military aid and intelligence sharing, which is a big part of how Ukraine is able to conduct attacks against Russian forces, as well as stop or deter Russian attacks against them.
Welcome to Reporter's Notebook, where we talk to the Washington Examiner's top journalists about the stories breaking on their beats. I'm Jim Antle, and I'm joined today by defense reporter Mike Brest. Mike, these are really in a state of flux, but talk a little bit about the latest in the negotiations between the United States, Russia, and Ukraine.
So earlier this week, the U.S. Had senior diplomats travel to Saudi Arabia, where they met with senior Ukrainian officials. At the end of that meeting, they came out with a joint statement saying that Ukraine had agreed to a U.S.-created proposal for a 30-day ceasefire. And so both Ukrainian and U.S. leaders said after this meeting that given Ukraine's support for it, the ball was now in Russia's court to determine what they choose to do, and this would give the entire world, but also the Trump administration, a clear-eyed vision of whether or not Russia was willing to negotiate an end to the war or not. And so at this point, we've heard some conflicting messages from both Kremlin officials, as well as we heard from President Vladimir Putin earlier today, who effectively said what we expected him to, which was that they agree with the sentiment of ending the war, but they want to do it with certain stipulations, some of which they got into, some of which he kept vague. But one of the big things that they've talked about now for several years as this war has gone on, and even predating it, is the concern that they have of Western NATO expansion. Now, this is an issue that President Putin has mentioned for many years. At the same time, NATO is a defensive alliance that doesn't pose an active threat to anyone, because it's a defensive alliance in which members agree to support one another in a time of crisis. One of the main principles of NATO is Article 5, which says if one country is attacked, it's viewed as if every country is attacked, or your country is attacked. And so the only time ever Article 5 has even been invoked is the day after 9/11, which is when a bunch of European allies came to the U.S.'s support, obviously after the 9/11 terror attacks. And so it is interesting to also note that, given we've seen President Trump's comments about NATO spending, given that he has continued to rail upon European allies who aren't reaching the 2% defense spending minimum.
So what's going on in Kursk? I mean, there's been some Russian advances there, it seems, or at least Ukrainian losses.
That's right. So to back up a little, Kursk is this border town area in Russian territory that Ukraine conducted a surprise offensive, actually going into Russian territory and occupying this plot of land, or this area. And so this area they've held since August, but they've slowly lost some of the territory that they had once held. And at this point, they now hold only about 30% of the territory that they once did. And again, this is in Russian territory. And so there has been a sizable collapse of Ukraine's ground there over the last week or so, which does in fact coincide with the U.S. and the Trump administration's decision to pause U.S. military aid and intelligence sharing, which is a big part of how Ukraine is able to conduct attacks against Russian forces, as well as stop or deter Russian attacks against them.
So the head of NATO is coming to Washington, D.C. We'll be meeting with President Trump. What do we expect?
I think we expect President Trump to repeat a lot of the sentiments he shared since coming back to office about NATO. NATO countries need to spend more, both in terms of their own defense, but also take a larger burden share of supporting Ukraine. And so this is an issue that President Trump has brought up several times. Currently, every NATO ally is required to spend 2% of their GDP on defense spending. The president has said he wants to see that be raised all the way to 5%. As of last year, no country hit 5% on defense spending. The U.S. was at about 3.4%, and there were a handful of countries that did surpass 4%, and there are countries specifically in Eastern Europe which really feels the threat from Russia, tend to get close to 5% or even surpass 5% in the coming years. But that's more so a small minority than the overall share of the alliance.
And there likely will be some discussion of what's going on in Ukraine.
Absolutely. There will be a big issue because as President Trump tries to end the war, NATO, as well as many European allies that are in NATO, have felt a little pushed out of these deliberations and these negotiations, and so I'm sure the Secretary General will want to make sure that NATO and Europe's feelings and thoughts are represented in those conversations.
Thank you, Mike. You can read Mike and the rest of our national security team's coverage at washingtonexaminer.com.